In this lecture, we will discuss how to use Visual Studio.
As we saw in the last lecture, we're going to be using Visual Studio as our IDE for developing programs in Visual Basic. That means we need to be familiar with this IDE if we're going to use it properly. So there are several skills that you're going to want to get familiar with. And we will be going over how to do all these in a little bit, but I want to at least take some time to go over what it is that you should be able to do very early on when using Visual Studio. The first thing you need to be able to do is create a project. This is pretty straightforward because if we're going to write a program, we have to start somewhere. So we need to be able to go to the project options, which I believe is in the file menu. Then we can go in there and create a brand new project, and we can specify whether we're doing a Visual Basic. With Visual Studio, we can actually use other programming languages as well, such as C, C++, or even C#, but we will be focusing on Visual Basic for this class. You also need to be familiar with how to debug a project. So what we mean by debugging is we can run the program in Visual Studio, and if there's a problem, we can actually see what's going on while the program is running. So the way we would do this is we would go into the debug menu, and we would click on Start or even Start Debugging. There's two options. Start just means we run the program as is. Start Debugging means if we include options to debug, which means we can pause the program in the middle of execution, and we can actually look at what happens after every step. But we can use either option in the debug menu. And before we actually run the program, we have to make sure there aren't any errors. So if there aren't any errors, such as compile errors, syntax errors, those kind of things, so as long as we don't have those errors, the program will compile and then it will run, and it'll run just like if we were to run it on our computer as normal. And if there are any errors, it will produce an error list. So we will see a list of the errors, whether they're compile errors or other issues, and then we can fix them, and then we can go back into start or start debugging to see if we fixed the problems and then run the program. Now, we should also need to be familiar with how to save the project. This is pretty straightforward. You're familiar with saving stuff already. So we can go into the file menu and select Save All. That's the simplest way to do it, or you can just use Control S if you're familiar with that. And we're just basically making sure that we save the files. Now, we should also mention that when we debug or run the project, it's saved automatically. So when we click on Start or Start Debugging, before it even compiles, the first thing the IDE is going to do is to save all the files that are part of the project. And in fact, if we want to actually quit without doing any debugging, we have to save. So we're going to be required to save our files as we go. And of course, we need to be familiar with how to close the project. I mean, sure, you can just click the X button on the top right corner to exit out of Visual Studio completely, but maybe we want to close the project and open up another one. So we can go into the File menu, and there's an option that says Close Solution. It doesn't say Close Project, it's Close Solution, and that will close the entire project, and then we can open up another one. If we close a project, we should be able to reopen the project. And this is pretty simple. If we go into the File menu, there will be an option that says Open. From there, we can click on it, and there'll be a couple of options, but you'll want to click on Project/Solution. And then from there, you would need to pick the directory where the project is created and located. So here, when I mean by directory, we're just talking about a folder. So we find a directory where the project is actually created, and inside of there, you will find the project name, and there should be a .sln file. This stands for solution file. You have to click on this file to open up the actual project. If you try to click on any of the other files, those are just individual files. They're not associated. I mean, they are kind of associated with the solution, but clicking on any of them will not open up the entire project. You have to click on the solution file in order to open up the entire project with all the files associated with it. So we should be able to open up the project. We should be able to locate the project directory. And what we mean by that is when we click on Open, we usually have an idea of where the project is, especially if we just closed it. And I believe by default, it would open up the project directory of all the projects for Visual Studio. So like most people would have that under the Documents folder in Windows, so it would go there by default. But you should be able to find your project without going through Visual Studio. So you should be able to go into your computer, find the folder that contains your project, because, for example, you may need to run the executable without using Visual Studio. You can do that. So you have to be able to find where where your project file is. It's not too difficult once you know where the project folder for Visual Studio is. Like I said, by default, it should be located in either the Documents folder or the My Documents folder, just depending on what version of Windows that you have. And then finally, you should be able to transfer the project to somewhere else, whether you transfer it to somewhere else on your own computer or transferring it to another computer. This isn't too difficult, but the key thing with this is you have to make sure you transfer the entire directory. So you start with the initial folder that has the name of the project and copy everything in that folder, including the folder itself, and place it to another place, whether you're copying or you're cutting and pasting, but you need the entire folder. It's not enough to just take the solution file and move it somewhere else. You have to take everything if you want to transfer the project somewhere else. Now, there are some other windows and files that we want to be familiar with in Visual Studio. Now, the windows that we'll be talking about for now can be opened and closed using the View menu. There are some other options to the side that let us open up the windows, but all these windows can be accessed using the View menu in Visual Studio. So the first thing we have is what's called the Windows Form Designer window. Now, whenever you open up Visual Studio and you create a new project, as we saw in our last example, we had this initial file that was called form1.vb with design in square braces. And this is the window we're talking about. It's the designer window, so we can actually see the design view of our form that we're going to create. And this is what's called designer in the view menu. So if you need to open up, if you close it by accident and you don't know how to open up, you can go into the view menu and you can select on designer, and it would show that design view of our project. Now, there is another form that we can take a look at. Well, form maybe isn't the right word, but we have a file that's called form1.vb. This is the actual file or the code for it. So for a particular form, we actually have two different views. We have the design view where we can see how everything is laid out, and then we have the code view. And this is also available in the view menu. So if we close this and we need to open it back up, you can go into the view menu and you can click on the code window, and I think it just says code, and that will pop up the code view of the particular project. So remember, design view or designer view, however it's called, is giving us the layout of where we would place all of our text boxes and buttons and labels and all that. The code view is where we would actually write the code that would handle mouse clicks or handle properties of these different text boxes and labels. We also have the Solution Explorer. So this is basically giving us a list of all the different files that are part of the project. It also gives a different view. So we can, for example, click on a particular file that's part of the form. If we wanted to add additional resources or if we want to add additional files to it, we can do so. But it just kind of gives us a view of all the files. We also have the Properties window, and this is basically giving us all the properties of a particular item. So like if I click on a text box, we'll see the Properties window that would give us some different things that we can modify, such as the name of the text box, the size, the location, how we interact with it. But it just gives us some different fields that we can add some additional information for a particular item in our form. And then we also have the Toolbox window. We'll be using this several times. So if we want to add a new element to the form, so if we want to add like a new button or add a text box or add a field of some type or a label, we can click on the toolbox, and we can add whatever items we want into our form. So we'll be using all of these very often for all of our examples. There are some other windows and some other hidden files, but we'll see them later on in the course.